Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
All right, guys, time for review. Chapter 5 review. Study. Remember again, these videos are not supposed to give you every single little tidbit of information. This video is supposed to be an overall understanding knowledge of the chapter that just happened. Now, this is a big chapter. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 9 topics. I have your note sheet right here. You had about 9 topics to go over. So I'm going to go over and make sure I can try to sit there and help you understand what happened in the formation of our government. First thing we're going to cover is the Articles of Confederation. What were the Articles of Confederation? Remember, this was our first constitution. This was our first form of government. Remember, this was like the coolest, most strongest government in the world. No, I'm lying to you. This government was very weak. Remember, it could do some things, like it could declare war and it can coin money and all that other junk, but it could not collect taxes, which means it could not really do much. It could not raise an army, so it really couldn't do much, especially if we went to war. There's some things that had to happen. So it was very, very weak. It was unpopular. It was total the opposite of a monarchy, right? We didn't want to have a monarchy, so we made a weak government to begin with. It only lasted roughly about 10 years. Remember that. 10 years in the forming of our nation, and it did junk. It only formed one branch of government, the legislative branch of government. Each state had one vote. 9 out of 13 states had to agree on something to pass it. Good luck on that. They actually did pass a couple, but remember, they needed all 13 to amend. So there were exactly 0 amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Very, very weak. One important thing that came out of the Articles of Confederation was our first attempt at westward expansion, Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 included that group of states that are around the Great Lakes. And those are Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. These states right here, it's our first attempt westward. It's our first way to be able to make states come into the Union as a state. That's really a big thing about this. It's the way that we make territory states. And remember, in order for a colony to become a territory out there, you had to have 5,000 adult voting males, and then you had to have 60,000 people to apply for statehood. Once you can apply for statehood, you're good to go. But remember, the big thing about this that will come back and really cause a big stinker, some foreshadowing in this country: slavery was banned in a Northwest Ordinance. You could practice your religion freely. You had habeas corpus, which meant that you could not get arrested for any reason. You had no cruel and unusual punishment, meaning that you can't get your hand chopped off if you stole a candy bar. But the idea of bringing these states into the Union, this is the Northwest Ordinance, as well as being our first attempt at westward expansion. The economic crisis. Remember, this was a short 5-minute video, 6-minute video, whatever. I wanted to go into basically what happened. It's like, hooray, we won our freedom. Now what? Remember, I gave the analogy of you kick your mom out of your house and there went your allowance. What are we going to do? Remember, Britain closed off all of our trading ports on the Atlantic and the Caribbean, so we could not trade out through the Atlantic anymore. Spain, after the Treaty of Paris 1783, closed off the Mississippi River 1 year later in 1784. So we are stuck between the Atlantic Ocean, where we can't trade, and the Mississippi River, which we can't trade up and down. So what do? We start trying to trade between the states. States start making their own money. It's paper. It's worthless. It's not backed by any type of gold or silver. So we go into a high inflation. We have a depression, a small recession that comes out of this thing. Okay, so the economics after the Revolutionary War went south. Could not trade with Britain. Could not trade through the Mississippi River. We were really stuck. We couldn't control interstate trade between the states. One state thought they were better than another state, and oh my gosh, it was just terrible. Next thing we're going to talk about is Shays Rebellion. Remember, Daniel Shays, the farmer, he led the regulators, those other group of farmers, those other Army veterans from the Revolutionary War, those guys who were not getting paid. The Continental Congress was like, yeah, sure, we'll pay you, and they never did. So because of these high debts, these heavy taxes, and the farmers couldn't pay them, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts were foreclosing on the farms. They were taking the farms away. Well, Daniel Shays and his regulators were like, hey, if we just protest the courts from not opening, they can't take our farms. Dude, makes total sense. So they surround the Supreme Court. They're like, you won't open. And they get into this big skirmish, right? So now the Massachusetts is like, hey, Articles of Confederation, federal government, we need money. And they're like, sorry, we don't have any. We can't tax anybody. Well, then send an army down here to help us. Sorry, we can't even send an army down here to help you because we can't raise one. Oh, click. I hate this. So remember, out of Shays Rebellion, Americans are like, we need a stronger federal government to be able to support the people and protect the people of the United States. And what comes out of that? Boom, the Constitution. The Constitutional Convention gets together. These group of delegates, 1787, are like, hey, we're going to go ahead and revise the Articles of Confederation. And they're like, crumple up and throw it away. Like, hey, we can't revise this thing. It's a piece of junk. It's so weak. There's so many things wrong with it. We need to sit here and try to figure out a new form of government. And that's what the Constitution is. The Constitution is our first form of government that really lasts until today. Articles is the first form. Constitution is the real form, the one that lasts until today, over 200 years later. Flip. Okay, now this is what we're talking about. We're talking about how many branches of government it collects. 3 branches of government it creates: the legislative, Congress; the executive, the president, vice president, cabinet; and the judicial, that's the Supreme Court. Remember who's in what branch of government. They are 3 branches. There's a system of checks and balances to make sure that one branch gets stronger than the other branch. Remember that is to make sure that they are all equal. The Constitution fixes a lot of the problems of the articles, specifically the ones that say stuff like you don't need to have all 13 states to amend anything. You don't need to have 9 out of 13 to pass. You don't need to have these states. Now, we can tax now. That's a big thing. We can tax as the government. We can raise an army, okay? So the Constitution fixes the errors of the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution is the set of laws that the government and the people have to follow. It is named the supreme law of our land, right? This is the whole thing behind it. It was hard to pass. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison wrote those 85 essays, those Federalist Papers, trying to get the people to go ahead and say the Constitution is good and it's not going to overpower the states. All right, so how do we in the United States show that we have the power? Those first 3 words of the Constitution: we the people, we have the power. We live in a popular sovereignty, meaning that we vote for our reps, who we are going to learn about in a second. That's a big thing in this country: representation. We vote for our representation to support us in Congress. All right. What is federalism? That's the last thing we talked about, because it creates a federalism between the states and the federal government. It basically says that whatever the federal government cannot handle, they're going to go ahead and allot to the states, which means what? We can get a passport from the United States. We can get a state ID from the state you live in. The federal government delivers the U.S. mail, the United States Postal Service, but we get our driver's licenses through the state of North Carolina, in this state where I live. Now, why is that important? Can you imagine going to Washington, D.C. to try to get your driver's license? Nothing would ever get done. All right, so now we're talking about the Constitution. We have to talk about the Bill of Rights, another one of these compromises we were talking about here. The compromise of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a compromise because a lot of these southern states were like, hey, we need to protect our slaves. Our slaves are our property. How can we protect our property? We have to protect our property, saying that you can protect individuals. So southern states were like, we are not going to ratify this Constitution until there is a Bill of Rights protecting individual citizens, which the Bill of Rights does. It is our first 10 amendments: freedom of speech, freedom of practice of religion, freedom of protest, right to bear arms. You know, you don't have to worry about quartering soldiers. Go all the way down, and the first 10 amendments is our Bill of Rights. James Madison, the father of it. Another compromise, the Great Compromise, the representation. Remember that video? Representation, population, right? No, you're a state, I'm a state, we're all states, we get equal representation. Great Compromise comes out with representation. How are we going to have representation in Congress? And remember, there were 3 plans, 2 to begin with, but 3 to finalize. You had the big state, the large state. The Virginia plan said representation, population. That means that the representation should be based on the population because they have the biggest populations. And if you have more representation in Congress, you have the more kind of authority or more influence on the outcome of the government. But then you had the New Jersey, the small state plans, who were like, hey, you're a state, I'm a state, we're all states, we should have equal representation. So the Connecticut plan, or the Great Compromise, the Sherman plan, comes through and it says this: we will create a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. Remember the 2 houses. The upper house in the Senate uses the small state plan, that equal representation to the states. Today, each state has 2 senators. And then you have the lower house, the House of Representatives. That takes the big state plan plan into play where you can have each state represented by state's population. All right, so remember that. Connecticut Plan, Great Compromise, bicameral legislature, 2 houses, Senate, House of Representatives, and one is the Senate is based on equal representation, which is, you know, what the small states wanted, and the House of Representatives based on population of the state, which is what the big state wanted. And remember, nothing can get passed in the government unless both houses approve. 3/5 compromise, that's the last compromise that we're going to go over here in this chapter. This is the one that's the big smack in the face. This is how people were going to count slaves as representation. If you remember correctly, we said the South had a big population. They also had a big population of slaves. And remember, they were saying, you can't tax our slaves because they're property. And then you had them saying, but our slaves are people and we have to count them as representation because that gives us more people than the states of the North. So you had the South saying you should count the slaves as population so then they can have more influence in the government. Then you had the North, the northern states, the ones that don't use the plantation farming, the ones that are making slavery illegal. They're like, yo, man, you can't count those slaves as representation because you have so many of them. At one point in time, it's half your population. That's not cool. So what do they agree on? They agree on the 3/5 compromise. And what does the 3/5 compromise say? It says that 3/5 of the slave population can be counted as representation for the numbers in Congress. Now, what does that mean? That means that one slave only equals 3/5 of a person, or for every 5 slaves, only 3 counts. So that's your review for chapter 5. I hope you do well on the test. Go ahead and study your paper. Don't rely on this video. It's a majority of information, but not all of it. I had to just bling, blah, blah, bling, blah, go through it. Good luck on your test, and we'll see you for chapter 6 when we cover Federalists and Anti-Federalists.